Good afternoon and welcome to the Crop Production and WASDE briefing. My name is Joe Parsons. I serve as chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board here at USDA's National Ag Statistics Service. This briefing is for the Secretary of Agriculture and other policymakers at USDA to better understand the content and context of today's reports. We're honored to have Gloria Montano Green, Deputy Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation, as our Secretary Designate today, and Dr. Seth Meyer, USDA's Chief Economist. Madam Secretary, Undersecretary, I want to share that we had great support and assistance from Kate Jackson of our St. Louis office and Anika Siegelhorst from our Great Lakes Regional Office, both helping on today's report. I also want to welcome our guests from the U.S. sugar industry, as we have representatives from various aspects of both the beet and sugarcane production with us today. I also want to welcome staff from the American Soybean Association. Glad you all could join us. I have a few notes for our live streaming audience. The crop production and WASDE reports are considered principal federal economic indicator reports. The Office of Management Budget provides specific guidance on how these important reports are to be released. OMB's statistical policy instructs policymaking officials not to refrain from making public comment regarding the content of these reports within 1 hour of the release. We will not take questions from during this briefing from the public. However, NASS and World Board staff are available for email and phone questions, and NASS will host a social media event 1 hour after the release of these data. We strive to have everything presented at this briefing match the official record. However, should there be any discrepancy between what is presented at this briefing and the published estimates, always refer to the official published estimates. For that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Lance Honig, Chief of the NASS Crops Branch, and he will be immediately followed by Dr. Mark Jekanowski, Chair of the World of the Ag Outlook Board. Lance?
All right, thank you, Joe. Good afternoon to everyone, both in the room and out on our live stream audience. Great to have you with us today. I've got a lot of information, as I always do, to share. And so just like normal, I'll jump in by talking a little bit about some of the survey work and other data that we had in preparing these forecasts today. First, for our barley, oats, and wheat, we had 2 survey efforts that I'll talk about for all 3 of those crops. Our farmer survey, the ag yield survey, as we call it, you can see just over 5,000 producers were sampled this period. We collected that data from June 29th through July 7th, essentially asking them to report what their either expected yields were, or in many cases at this point in the season, they're reporting their actual realized yields. In addition to that survey for the winter wheat, we also had our objective yield survey. As a quick reminder, this is a field-based survey, so rather than surveying farmers, we actually sample fields of winter wheat. In fact, 1,155 of those fields. We actually lay out 2 units in each of those fields that are selected, and we send those trained enumerators into those locations where they take counts and measurements. And as the crop gets close to maturity, they actually harvest portions of those plots, send them off to our lab in St. Louis, and we do some analysis work there. And you can see that field work was completed June 24th through July the 1st. And then last but not least, just a reminder, we do have our final forecast of the season for the citrus crops in here. So when we think about Florida citrus in particular, survey work's all done. We're just wrapping up the final information with that administrative data that we typically talk about. Very quickly, just a look here at those ag yield sample sizes by state. Again, just as a reminder, the darker the color, the larger the sample. So again, the darkest color in Kansas, you can see that's our largest sample, as you might expect again this month with winter wheat as a crop of focus. Very quickly, before we look at the individual crops, just a quick look at the U.S. Drought Monitor as of July the 4th. Obviously, this has looked a little bit different throughout the season, but here's what it looks like as of the beginning of this month. Generally speaking, this would be pretty good news for winter wheat this time of year as we're trying to get through harvest, but maybe not so great news for some of the other crops in some of these locations. We will start things off with winter wheat. We've got a couple of graphics here to open with from our weekly crop progress and condition report. First, here you can see the percent of the crop rated good to excellent by week. The dark red line is the current season. See the previous 5 seasons on there. And really the big story here is just that steady increase that we've seen since late April. Obviously, we were very low coming out of winter in those first few weeks, but it's just been a steady climb ever since then. And then from a progress standpoint, it's really becoming a slow and drawn out harvest. There's been a lot of rain showers across a lot of parts of really all over the place, right? And so we knew it was slow, we knew it was falling behind, but it wasn't until I dug through the data I realized as of this past week, that's the slowest progress since 1995. And so it really is starting to drag on just a bit. With that said, let's go ahead and take a look at the updated forecast for winter wheat. First of all, acreage unchanged from what we just published on June 30th in the acreage report for both planted and harvested. But as a quick reminder, since our last production forecast, planted area was reduced 500,000 acres, but harvested acres was increased 414,000 acres. So as you think about the production change from June, you've got yield influence and that additional 414,000 acres of harvested area back to there. So it gets a little bit confusing with that interim acreage adjustment in that report. So with that said, let me let you know, we're now forecasting 46.9 bushels per acre for our yield. That's up 4.5% or 2 bushels from what we forecast back in June. So we're now down just 0.2% or 1/10 of a bushel from last year's final yield. Therefore, we're looking at production at 1.21 billion bushels. That's up 6.2% again because of the additional acres and the yield increase. And so overall year to year, we're looking at a 9.3% increase. Next, we'll just take a quick look at the yield and how that tracks over the last 30 seasons. You can see that gray trend line plotted in there. Again, very similar to last year's yield now, so the second consecutive year below trend there. Looking at it on a state-by-state basis, this first map that I have for you here shows the state yield as the top number. The lower number is the percent change from last month's forecast. So here you can see how the change from last month, that 2 bushel increase at the national level, is distributed across the states. And as a reminder, all the states colored in blue are increasing, in red they're decreasing, and the deeper the color, the larger the change. And so you can see kind of leading the way in the part of the country there, Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, all 10+% increase on yield this month. But as you just shift east from there, you can see Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, very good yields. In fact, every time you see the pound sign next to a number, that's a record. Illinois, Kentucky, Maryland, Tennessee, Virginia, all looking at record yields. And that Illinois yield, several bushels above the previous record. So we're getting very good reports of yield all through that part of the country. Next, just to give you a quick reminder of how yields compare state by state to last year. So this map's laid out just like the previous one, except we're comparing back to the previous year. So again, Kansas, our leading producing state, even though we saw a big increase from last month, still well below what they saw last year due to the dry conditions earlier this season. Looking at the production over time, not really a big story here. You can see the 1.21 billion bushels, pretty much right in line with what we've seen over the recent seasons. Just a little bit of information from that objective yield survey. First, what you see on this graphic is the percent of those samples that were processed in the lab, so they were mature enough to be harvested and sent off to the lab. 52% this month, a little bit lower than what we would typically see in July, but as I mentioned early on, harvest progress running well behind, so the maturity a little bit below what we've seen in the recent seasons. Maybe some more interesting information from the objective yield survey. What you see here, the vertical bars all represent the number of heads per square foot that we measured from that survey. Those red dots represent the current yield forecast. And so for this season, the number of heads per square foot, 39.7, that's the lowest we've seen since 2014. So those early dry conditions really having a big impact on plant population. Next, just to update you on those production numbers when they're breaking out by class. You can see fairly sharp increases from last month in the hard red winter and soft red winter totals. Slight decline in the white winter up in the Northwest. So how does this compare with what folks were expecting? Just give you a quick look here. A reminder, the way this graphic is laid out, each of those blue dots represents a individual industry member's published expectation of the winter wheat production. The red block represents the NASS forecast. You can see that red block a little bit higher than those dots. So probably a little bit of a surprise with this production forecast today. Next, we'll take a look at other spring wheat. Again, just a quick look from a condition and progress standpoint first. The condition ratings here, percent rated good to excellent, pretty steady the last few weeks, but below 4 of the previous 5 seasons. So not the worst we've seen, but certainly not the best either. And so as we look at that first forecast for yield and production of the season, again, like winter wheat, no change to the acres we published at the end of June. 45.2 bushels per acre is our forecasted yield. That's down 2.2% or 1 bushel per acre from last year's final yield. So that puts our production forecast at 479 million bushels, just slightly below what was produced last season. Looking at how that yield compares over the recent seasons, again, as I mentioned, slightly below last year, and the third consecutive year below trend expected for other spring wheat. On a state-by-state basis, again, since this is our first forecast of the season, we'll only show you a comparison to last year, and you can see it's kind of a tale of two sides of the country here, or the two sides of the growing region, I should say. Obviously, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, major producers, all looking at lower yields this year. Of course, again, with the weather we've seen in that part of the country, expectations a bit lower. To the west, though, Montana, big increase. If you remember back to the winter wheat map, we actually saw a big increase in winter wheat there as well. So great conditions for folks in Montana to some extent, but it's been really bad the last couple of seasons. So a lot of that big increase has to do with really poor situation last year. Looking at the production over time for the other spring wheat, again, probably not a really big story here, pretty much in line with what we've seen in recent seasons. And from an industry standpoint, pretty much in line with what folks appear to be expecting here as well. You can see the dot right in the middle of those expectations. Next, moving on to durum wheat. We don't actually publish condition ratings at a national level for durum, so I thought I'd throw a chart in for North Dakota since they're obviously our largest producing state there. As you can see, looking at the red line there, it's been a bit of a steady decline after starting pretty positive, but conditions have been falling over the recent weeks. They did level off this past week, so we'll see how things shape up from here on out. Looking at the forecast, again, no change from the June acreage report on planted and harvested area, definitely down significantly from last year. But yield, we're forecasting 37.9 bushels per acre. That's down 6.4% or 2.6 bushels per acre from last year's final yield. So overall, with the decline in acreage as well, we're looking at 54 million bushels, 15.5% below what was produced last season. Looking at that yield, you see it certainly has some big swings from year to year. This year, though, we're pretty steady compared to last year, but just below trend for this season. Looking at those yields and how they compare to last year on a state-by-state basis, actually North Dakota and Montana fairly close in acreage, but certainly the two of those dominating the overall production. And again, as we kind of talked about with other spring wheat, not so great in North Dakota, but big bounce back from last year for folks in Montana. Looking at the durum wheat production and how it compares over time, fairly similar to what we've seen in recent years, but definitely lower than some of the larger totals we've seen if you go back a few years. That's been the trend in a downward direction for durum. Looking at the expectations for durum wheat production, a little bit on the low side of what folks were expecting. So maybe a little bit of a surprise there for folks today. Looking at a few other crops included in the report today, we also have our first yield and production forecast for barley. You can see the increase in acreage, even though it's no change from our June acreage report. But our yield forecast, 70.1 bushels per acre. It's down just 2.2% from last year. But with the acreage increase, overall production is expected to be up 1.7% year over year. Looking at oats, A little bit of a reduction in acreage this year compared to last. Also a bit of a decrease in yield expected at 62.8 bushels per acre, 3.1% below last year. So overall production expected to be down 13.5% from what was produced last season. And then looking at the flue-cured tobacco, just a slight adjustment in acreage from what we published just a couple of weeks ago, down 4% year to year. Yield expected to be down as well. So overall production 5.8% below last year. That's the second lowest production on record for flue-cured tobacco. And as a reminder, North Carolina makes up about 82% of the flue-cured tobacco here in the U.S. We've got a couple other crops from out west to talk about today as well. First off, this is our second forecast of the season for almond production. You can see we're expecting 2.6 billion pounds now to be produced. That is up 4% from the forecast back in May, which now puts us up year over year. So actually 1.4% above what was produced last season. And that would represent the third highest almond production on record. Folks out there reporting that the nut set was below average, but the size is above normal. So they're now expecting that larger crop. And then the apricots, although it is not exclusively a California crop, about 86% of it's produced in California. There you can see we are looking at a crop up 9.3% from last year, but that would still be the third lowest total on record. We've generally seen declining acreage for that crop in recent years, and therefore we're looking at low production totals. The last crops I have to talk about today would be as I mentioned, our final forecast of the season for the citrus crops. Most of the changes you see in here from the last forecast are not Florida, but the other states that we forecast on a quarterly basis. So we haven't had an update since April for those. So some adjustments there. Overall, you can see all orange production now at 2.52 million tons. That's overall down 26.4% year over year. Florida is contributing a lot to the year over year change there. But as you can see, most of that adjustment from the last forecast is in the Valencia portion of the crop. And in fact, most of that adjustment is in California, down 1.1 million boxes there from what they had previously forecast. Looking at grapefruit, down 2.1% from the previous forecast to 334,000 tons. That's down 10.7% year over year. The change there is actually mostly in Texas, down about 170,000 boxes from the last forecast. Very minor adjustment in Florida, but as a reminder, that's the fourth lowest Florida grapefruit production on record. Looking at the lemons, down 13.4%. From that last forecast, we're down 300,000 boxes in Arizona, but down 3 million boxes in California. That's what's driving the change there. And then last but not least, the tangerines, the bright spot on the citrus crop here, not only up from the last forecast, but you can see up 22.7% year over year. Of course, California is the big producer of the tangerines. They're actually up 1 million boxes from their last forecast, and overall 4.5 million boxes more than they produced last season. This next slide just highlights some of the upcoming reports just around the corner. Cattle and cattle on feed on the 21st. At the end of the month, we've got our ag prices as well as farm production expenditures. And then when we roll the month around, as usual, on the 1st, we'll have our monthly care reports, followed by the cash rents for the state level, as well as land values. And then August 11th, we've got that one circled on our calendar for sure. Obviously, our largest crop production report of the season. First look at yield and production for corn and soybeans and maybe some sugar. And cotton ginnings. Last but not least, just a reminder to folks that as usual, 1 o'clock this afternoon Eastern time, I will be on Twitter hosting our regular Stat Chat series. Old school Stat Chat today, Seth. Appreciate you joining us for the Twitter space last month. We'll probably do a Twitter space again next month for the August crop production report. So maybe we'll invite you to join. So that's the last slide that I have for you. I'm going to turn things over to Mark, but certainly be available to answer any questions you've got when he finishes up.
All right.
All yours.
All right.
Thank you, Lance, and good afternoon. Like Lance, I've got a lot of
A lot of material to cover, so let's jump right in. Focusing on the WASDE here, just a couple things to note to kind of prepare your mind for what's coming next. Obviously, this is a month, July, where we incorporate all of the acreage information from the acreage report and the grain stocks data, and we're also in the U.S. looking at recent weather conditions as well and the potential implications for yields. Other things looking at weather and production in other parts of the world. Or this month, we're going to focus in a little bit on the Canadian wheat crop. It's been pretty dry there. Implications there for Canada's wheat production. Also, we've seen some dryness across Northern Europe. I'm going to give you a little meteorology lesson about blocking highs and how that has affected the weather conditions there and implications for rapeseed and winter wheat as well. And then also a little discussion of Pakistan's cotton crop and a huge rebound from last year's devastating production situation. So let's jump in on global wheat production. Looking at the back year, just really truing up final data here. Australia production increased 700,000 tons. That's ABARES data, and that is a record Australia, a record crop out of Australia. Also some final production estimates from Ukraine raised that crop a bit. And then looking into the new crop year, a few things to note there. Argentina, that's a area adjustment lower based on AgMin data. Canada, we'll talk about just a bit. As I noted, we trimmed our yield prospects there. EU down as well, as I noted on recent dry conditions across especially the northern EU, and then Morocco up a bit. That's AgMin data as well. And then we'll talk also about the US, of course. So real quick on Canada spring wheat, just a quick review of the main production regions. Wheat grown across Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, mainly. Spring wheat here we're talking about primarily. And generally speaking, it's just been dry. Not devastatingly dry, but drier than you'd like to have it, especially toward the west and up into the Peace River Valley. Shows up in the VHI as well. You know, conditions relatively good in parts of Saskatchewan, and then they kind of dry out west toward Alberta. Also some dryness in Manitoba. So overall, kind of enough information there to suggest yields will be down from last year, down a bit from last year. Still above the 5-year average, and reflecting the fact that area is at a 10-year high. This is still going to be a large crop, despite the trim in yields this month. Global balance sheet, global wheat balance sheet, focusing on the old crop. A couple things to note there. Beginning stocks up a bit on the old crop. That just reflects some data revisions for Egypt going back 10 years there. So incorporating that into the balance sheet. Total supply, we talked about increasing in Australia and in Ukraine. Trade up a bit. That is mainly an increase in our exports of Russian wheat, exports by Russia. And then in the new crop year, 23-24, so we're carrying in a little bit higher beginning stocks this month than we had penciled in last month. Production down a bit. We talked about production already, so supplies tightening up just a bit. Feed use down. That is largely I'm sorry, feed use up. That's largely in China. The poor wheat quality they had there because of the rains and the flooding. Trade down a bit, mainly lower exports out of Canada and Argentina, where crops were smaller as well. Partially offset by higher exports by Russia, and ending stocks tightening up a bit there, as you can see. So US balance sheet. Old crop year, kind of, nearing a final balance sheet here. Clearly, we've got the grain stocks information from June 30th to give us our ending stocks, final ending stocks for the old crop wheat. Truing up trade data as well, imports and exports, nearly final there. So a little bit tighter ending stocks for last year carrying into the new crop year. Average market price for the old crop year reduced 2 cents, and that will be the final season average market price for the old crop wheat. Now, in the new crop year, of course, incorporating the information we got this morning from NAS on wheat production, combined with a little bit tighter carry-in, leads to a small increase in total supply this month, 51 million bushels. So, and that mainly is allocated across higher stocks and higher feed and residual. Season average market price dropped 20 cents per bushel. Still the fourth highest season average market price on record, but consistent with increased supplies and recent price trends as well. So moving into rice, clearly not a lot going on here globally. The only story really to talk about is in the US, so we'll get to that when we get there. Even on the world rice balance sheet, not much to say here. Production change is all in the US. Trade up a bit, exports, that's higher exports out of the US and Vietnam, and then a modest increase in ending stocks. So moving into the US balance sheet, again, looking at the old crop first. Imports down, that's lower imports of medium and short grain rice. So tightening up total supply just slightly, a million hundredweight. Domestic use down, that is based on data from the rice stocks report, came out June 30th. Exports, again, kind of truing up to recent trade data. Long grain up 2 million hundredweight, partially offset by lower medium short grain exports of 1 million hundredweight. So ending stocks down a bit, 1 million hundredweight carrying into the new crop year. Then, of course, incorporating the information from the June acreage report. The yield adjustment there, that as you might have figured out, that mainly reflects the fact that the acreage increase was mainly in medium short grain, higher yielding varieties, so that raises the all rice yield. So production up 8.3 million hundredweight. Imports again down, consistent with last year as well, consistent with that trend continuing. That's higher domestic supplies of medium short grain, given that big increase in acreage that we see has happened. So domestic use up a bit. Exports, so pretty strong upward adjustment in our export forecast. That's reflecting higher supplies, but 4 million hundredweight of medium short grain and 2 million of long grain rice. Just basically lower U.S. prices and more supplies, supporting that higher export forecast. Average market price, season average market price reduced 60 cents per hundredweight. And that is all on lower long grain and southern medium grain prices. So moving into corn production, old crop. So the old crop, of course, as you know, reflects the current crop in being harvested in Brazil, and that crop is expected to be record large. Was raised another 1 million tons this month. Argentina, on the other hand, as you know, suffered pretty severe drought. That crop is reduced 1 million tons, so offsets there. leaving 20 last year's production unchanged. On the new crop, changes in the United States kind of dominate the changes in global supply. So we'll get to that on the domestic balance sheet. Other than that, mainly we're truing up to recent government data. The increase for Canada reflects StatCan data, European Union, Ukraine. All of that is official government data. So global balance sheet. Looking at the old crop year, feed use up 1.6 million tons, mainly reflecting U.S. Higher feed use in the U.S. reflecting the grain stocks report that was issued June 30th, partially offset by lower feed use in Ukraine, the EU, and Russia. Trade essentially unchanged, but there's actually lots of offsetting changes there that lead to no overall change in global corn trade for the old crop year, and we're, as you can see, carrying in slightly tighter carrying stocks into the new crop year, and that primarily, and that's really a U.S. story, tighter U.S. stocks coming into the new crop year. New crop year feed use up a bit, mainly that's Canada and the European Union. Trade up 500,000 tons. That's mainly more exports out of Ukraine. So Ukraine exports now at 19.5 million tons, but that would be down from 28 last year. U.S. balance sheet. So let's talk about the old crop year first. Again, as we always do, important implications from the grain stocks report, higher feed and residual reflecting that information from the grain stocks report, tighter stocks in there. But that more than offsets reductions in ethanol, corn use for ethanol from both EIA and grain crushing data. Exports down as well, just reflecting relatively slow pace and sales, less competitive with Brazil. So exports down and ending stocks tightening up 50 million bushels. No change to our season average market price for either crop year, but now let's talk about the new crop year. So here, planted area, obviously taking information from the acreage report. The one thing we did do this month, as you can see, we cut our yield forecast, and it's been dry in June. Got some beneficial rains more recently, probably saved that crop, but acknowledging that things had been dry earlier in the season, suggesting the justification for a little bit of a trimming to that yield forecast. So taking that into account, higher area, lower yield, and slightly tighter beginning stocks, leaves the balance sheet virtually unchanged. So stocks up just 5 million bushels and no change in our price forecasts. Moving into soybeans, global soybean production here again, it's really entirely a U.S. story. Small change in our Canada production forecast just based on StatCan data, but really it's a U.S. story driven by the acreage report and the changes that implied. So global balance sheet. So looking again at the old crop year, crush, we reduced 1 million tons this month. Mainly that's lower crush in Brazil, which also corresponds to higher exports by Brazil. So crushing less domestically, exporting more. especially increasing exports to China. That's why you also see increased imports by China. Increased imports by China for the old crop year suggests a little bit of shifting, less need for imports next crop year. Total imports unchanged year over year, but we reduced our new crop year import forecast by China by 1 million tons. New crop year balance sheet, again, dominated by the change in U.S. production, down 5.4 million tons, tightening up supplies there. Crush globally is down mainly in many of the soybean importing countries, reflecting lower imports especially in China, but also Bangladesh, Egypt, Pakistan, Thailand, and Turkey. Trade down, that largely reflects lower exports out of the U.S. and global ending stocks tightening up a bit, 2.4 million tons, as you can see. So regarding the U.S. balance sheet, old crop, again, always, looking at the latest trade data, imports raised 5 million bushels. That's mainly that's imports from Brazil coming in. Exports, old crop export forecast reduced 20 million bushels, just again reflecting the recent pace and level of outstanding sales. So pulling that forecast back. So ending stocks up 25 million bushels carrying into the new crop year, incorporating the information from the June acreage report regarding planted and harvested area. Didn't make a change to our soybean yield forecast. That, as you know, that crop tends to be a little bit more resilient, and so we'll continue to watch it and anticipate new information from NASS, new yield information from NASS next month. So production down 210 million bushels, and crush we lowered modestly 10 million bushels. But again, crush demand is still being supported by renewable diesel demand. So that's providing some support there. Exports take the bulk of the reduction in those tighter supplies that we're seeing. So lowered our export forecast 125 million bushels. And that also reflects just lower demand by China. Season average market price raised 30 cents per bushel, consistent with tighter supplies. And at that price, we have a ratio with corn of 2.6. So just a little diversion here. I mentioned the weather conditions in the EU. This had implications, as we noted, for wheat, but also especially for rapeseed. Rapeseed, of course, being another oil seed. So I'm going to talk real quickly about that. This is just the areas of the EU, primary areas where rapeseed is produced. And basically what we saw here is, the weather conditions in spring started out very favorable, abundant rains, good moisture, but starting in May, spring turned extremely dry, and that dryness continued into June. And essentially what happened here meteorologically is that a high pressure system developed off the northwest coast of the EU. And it developed there in late May, and it just sat there. So a blocking high, and then it stayed there in June as well. And essentially what that does is it blocked any rainfall from coming across that area. You can see it pretty clearly where it started at the end of May. And we noted there, when we did our May WASDE, things were looking great. And then this is just northern France, for example. Then the rainfall just really came to a halt. Saw nothing for several weeks, and East Germany as well. So it kind of shows across that area of northern EU. So going into May, reflecting great conditions, vegetation health looked looked wonderful, but by the end of June, things really turned dry, turned much worse. So this corresponds with the primary rapeseed areas across the EU. So reflecting that, we trimmed our yields down almost 4% for the EU rapeseed crop. So let's move into cotton. Just let me get caught up here on my notes. Bear with me just a second. So old crop 2022 cotton production. Argentina cotton production trimmed a bit. That's just based on some data revisions for Argentina. Brazil and Australia, that's harvest results, crop coming in quite favorably. So harvest results there. India, that's a noteworthy one as well. Raised our India production forecast for the old crop year. Just reflecting on, if you recall the story, the India arrivals were historically slow. It led us to believe that crop was smaller than we expected. Now those arrivals are coming in. They've continued to come in, and suggesting that indeed that crop was there and farmers were just holding on, hoarding them, not selling until recently. So that's the old crop year, new crop year, some adjustments. Really, we're looking way ahead here on the Southern Hemisphere. Australia up mainly based on some industry reports. These are crops that aren't even planted yet. So these are really anticipated acreage increases. Argentina down as well based on some government data. Pakistan we'll talk about now. This is for Pakistan. This is current year crop, and you'll notice a huge rebound from last year's production level. And we'll take a short tour of Pakistan, just the main cotton production regions of Pakistan there. Essentially, most of the production in Pakistan is dependent on irrigation. This year, they're going into the season with very favorable snowpack, good irrigation supplies. So that's supporting higher acreage. And just as a review of where we were last year at this time, see if so the red line is the current year. Right about this time last year, things were also looking pretty good. And then suddenly we had this once in a 1,000-year rainfall event, flooded Pakistan, and devastated their cotton crop. Obviously not expecting that this year, expecting good conditions and basically a strong rebound and a strong rebound in their cotton production and a strong rebound in their acreage, particularly in particular. So global balance sheet, old crop year, consumption raised a bit, made some corrections there. India accounts for about 500,000 of that 700,000 bale increase in cotton consumption. Ending stocks up a bit, mainly driven by higher production, as I talked about in the earlier slide. Moving into the new crop year, consumption we're revising lower by 500,000 bales. We reduced our China consumption estimate, China consumption estimate in particular, reflecting the economic weakness that that's increasingly being realized there. But we also raised China's imports, so reduced their consumption, raised their imports, basically as their imports rebound toward normal levels. Prices have normalized between China and the rest of the world. And there's expectations that China will implement a sliding scale quota, and that's also going to support higher imports. So US cotton supply and demand, beginning stocks up just a bit, mainly reflecting lower old crop exports that are almost perfectly offset by higher US mill use, but those were small changes. Production basically unchanged, but noting there, of course, that we took the June acreage report data on planted area. We did raise our or reduced our abandonment for Texas, reflecting again continued recent favorable rains there. Yield down a bit, but again, that's sort of reflecting the fact that, you know, you got lower acreage in some of the higher yielding areas and higher harvested area in some of the lower yielding areas. So brings yield down overall. In production, essentially unchanged, as you can see. So a small increase in total supply, just reflecting that increase in beginning stocks. Export forecast reduced reduced, reflecting weaker global demand and competition, of course, also from Brazil and Argentina. And season average market price reduced 1 cent per pound, which is consistent with higher global stocks. So moving into sugar. A lot going on here, and this of course is an important month for sugar. It's one of the U.S. needs calculation months, so ensuring that the stocks to use ratio hits 13.5% in that new crop year. But starting the discussion with the old crop, some small adjustments on the production side, mainly just reflecting processor data from SMD. Cane, the small reduction in cane production there, that is limited to Florida. Imports, sugar imports adjusted higher, mainly reflecting the increase in TRQ imports, reflecting the announcement last week, the increase last week in the TRQ. So that's incorporated directly. The re-export imports reduced 125,000 short tons. That is mainly reflecting a reconciliation of data between USDA and customs. So basically some administrative adjustments there. Mexico up a bit. High tier sugar imports increased as well. We saw one large raw sugar shipment, and then this was also increased just to reflect increase in the pace of refined sugar imports as well. Domestic deliveries adjusted lower, just reflecting again, truing up with data, the slower pace that we're now seeing there after raising it earlier in the year. So with that, ending stocks were raised 135,000 short tons, puts the stocks to use ratio at 14.4% for the old crop. And then moving into the new crop, so carrying in a little bit higher beginning stocks, 157,000 tons. Production up slightly as well. Beet production up, reflecting the acreage, adjusting for information in the acreage report. Imports up overall, led by an increase in TRQ imports, and that there reflects the additional specialty sugar TRQ increase announced last week. Re-export, that 125 just matches the change that we made for the old crop year. Again, just kind of some administrative data changes there. And then high tier, raised our high tier export forecast 45,000 tons, just to kind of reflect more realistic based on recent pace and last year's pace of high tier imports. So it's just kind of truing up to what we've been observing more recently. Domestic deliveries made the same change for the new crop year as we did for the old crop year. And stocks to use ratio, as you can see, targeted 13.5% means that we reduced Mexico's imports by 90,000 tons. this month. Speaking of Mexico, relatively small changes to the balance sheet this month. A few things worth noting on the old crop year. Mexico has been importing more sugar, so that's incorporated here. Exports up a bit as well. Production essentially set and down 6,000 tons from last month. For the new crop year, really no changes worth noting. Small adjustment to exports, lower exports offset by higher ending stocks. All right, let's move into meat and dairy. Kind of a lot going on here as well. Beef production for 2023. Now, of course, we're shifting to calendar years. 2023 beef production up 70 million pounds, reflecting a combination of higher marketings and higher cow slaughter, offset to some degree by lighter weights. But basically what we're seeing is a continued temporal shift, pulling forward of cattle, likely reflecting poor forage availability. And that is going to continue to tighten up supplies into 2024. And as you can see there, we reduced our production forecast by 100 million pounds. And that, again, is reflecting those tighter supplies being pulled forward. Pork production, no change for 2023. A little down a bit for 2024. This, of course, reflects the hogs and pigs report data. So for 2023, we basically had offsets, higher fourth quarter slaughter being offset by lower second and third quarter. Moving into 2024, we have lower farrowings being offset by higher pigs per litter. Broilers and turkeys for 2023, basically just truing up to recent data, slaughter and hatchery data suggesting higher production of broilers, higher and recent and slaughter data also reflecting higher turkey production. Prices, as you can see, continue very strong, especially for steers, tight supplies, strong demand. So a pretty healthy increase in our price forecast, steer price forecast in particular for both years, 2023 and 2024. Hogs as well, especially moving into 2024, tight supplies, strong demand expected to support prices there. Broilers and turkey, on the other hand, here we're seeing some increased production weighing on prices there, maybe some weakening of demand as well. Meat trade, main thing that stands out there, pretty small changes for beef, increased pork export forecast, strong demand from Latin America. China pork demand also continues relatively strong globally, so that's supporting higher pork exports from the US as well. Expect that to continue into 2024. Turkey exports growing just on higher supplies. No particular market or story there worth noting. Beef imports increased a bit for 2023. That's higher imports from Australia and New Zealand. Dairy, so US milk supply, no change for 2023 this month, though we did pull back our production forecast for 2024 based on both lower cow numbers and a small reduction in milk per cow. In terms of imports and exports, not a lot going on here as well on fat basis. Worth noting, export forecast pulled back. That is lower exports of butter and cheese for 2023. Lower butter exports also expected to carry into 2024. On skim solids, imports down. That's milk protein concentrates for 2023. A variety of offsetting products for 2024. And exports on a skim solids basis, tightening up a bit, reduced for 2023. That's lower exports of whey. And for 2024, that's lower exports of lactose. And then regarding dairy prices, Cheese prices pulled back for both 2023 and 2024, reflecting just abundant supplies there. Non-fat dry milk and dry whey prices down for both 2023 and 2024 as well. And that's mainly a story of international competition, just pressure on our markets because of international supplies, and then working it all into the class prices. Class 3 price for 2023 down a bit, and we're reflecting those lower prices for cheese and whey. Class 4 prices down, reflecting lower non-fat dry milk prices. All milk price down 40 cents per hundredweight. And then for 2024, class 3 price down down more than $1 per hundredweight, reflecting lower prices of cheese and whey, and the all milk price reduced 55 cents per hundredweight, and down to $19.10 per hundredweight. And with that, that wraps up all of the official information I have to report. So we're appreciate everyone tuning in today and listening to what we had to say. Hope you all learned something, and for all those tuning in online, we will see you back here next month. And with that, I will